Continuing now with The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Continuing now in chapter 16, which we began in the last session. On the morning of June 12th, the president and his entourage made the 3-hour and 45-minute flight from Salzburg to Cairo. Their motorcade entrance into the capital was jubilant. Several 100,000 people lined the curbs, rooftops, and balconies. For 3/4 of an hour, Nixon stood in an open limousine with Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. Cheering workers, soldiers, schoolchildren, trucked to their stations by the thousands, waved placards which hailed the president as, quote, a man of honor, and proclaimed both leaders great statesmen dedicated to peace and progress. Sadat was the perfect host. His welcoming remarks seemed to grasp Nixon's purpose. Quote, the role of the United States under the leadership of President Nixon is vital to promote peace and tranquility in the area. It is a great challenge, but I am convinced that with goodwill and determination, statesmen of the stature of President Nixon are apt to meet it. End quote. Nixon thanked Sadat privately for the huge crowds. Wait until we get to Alexandria, Sadat said. Henkel, in charge of advance, had vigorously opposed making a stop there. Having the presidential party overnight in Alexandria meant additional security arrangements and hosting a formal banquet without benefit of a resident embassy. The American ambassador was also opposed. He was offended at Nixon's preference for public appearances over substantive meetings. But the president overruled them both. The trip to Alexandria by train was politically important to Sadat, he said. As promised, the crowds were spectacular even before they reached the port city. Every mile of the route was lined with peasants, soldiers, workers. Women crowded close to the passing train, expressing their approval in the Arab high-pitched warble of prayer. A magnificent white stallion, mounted by a soldier carrying the flags of both countries, raced beside the tracks. The horse reared and threw its rider, then kept the pace alone. Ziegler estimated that 2 million people had turned out. The president's party rode in a luxurious rail coach that had been built in the 19th century. Many drank strong, dark beer from quart bottles. Dr. Lukash read the bestseller Jaws. A Secret Service agent interrupted him. You are wanted up front. Lukash was horrified when he reached the president. Nixon, in total disregard of his physician's advice, was standing in the open-sided Victorian observation car waving to the crowd. The president and Sadat shifted places from one side of the open car to the other, acknowledging the cheers, each holding on to the overhead brass railing to keep his balance. Lukash could see that the president was doing his best to disguise great pain. The physician took a seat on the red leather banquette in the rear of the car. The full-length green curtains dividing the coach kept him out of sight of the camera crews up front. He reached into his medical bag. A few minutes later, Nixon limped into a private compartment in the front of the train, where Lukash joined him. The physician gave him a painkiller and pleaded with him to keep off his feet. Nixon went back to stand with Sadat. Secret Service agents scanned the crowds almost desperately. Reports were coming through of a terrorist raid on an Israeli kibbutz, in which 3 women had been killed. In Beirut, a Palestinian terrorist group was taking credit for the attack. That is how every Arab should receive Nixon, the chief imperialist in the world, its communique said. Despite the massive presence of heavily armed Egyptian security forces, the president's exposure to the huge crowds seemed a senseless risk to his Secret Service contingent. Dr. Takash sought out Dick Kaiser, head of the Presidential Protection Unit of the Secret Service, and expressed his alarm at Nixon's behavior. You can't protect a president who wants to kill himself, Kaiser responded. Shortly before reaching Alexandria, Nixon and Sadat spoke informally with several of the 126 reporters aboard the train. Nixon moved again to the open side of the railroad car, calling their attention to the size and enthusiasm of the crowds. Sadat pointed to one of the many banners. We trust Nixon. He has fulfilled every word he gave, Sadat said. Encouraged by the White House Advance Office, Egyptian officials in Alexandria had mobilized a campaign-style greeting. By the time the presidential party arrived, more than 1 million people stood on the seawalls and in the streets. Some had climbed lampposts. The official party traveled by motorcade to the Ras El Tin Palace, where the president hosted a banquet for Sadat. It was as luxurious a residence as Nixon had ever seen, magnificently opulent. It had taken King Farouk 30 years to build. As he toasted Sadat, the president again remarked on the crowds. "There's an old saying that you can turn people out, but you can't turn them on," he said. "They have touched our hearts, and I'm sure the hearts of millions of Americans who saw that welcoming on television." Kissinger turned to Eagleburger and Scowcroft. "It's too bad that such crowds can't be turned out in the United States," he said. The three men laughed. The next day, June 14th, the president helicoptered to Giza and, defying his doctors again, toured the Great Pyramids on foot with Sadat. Returning to Cairo, the two leaders announced a joint agreement for economic cooperation, including a United States pledge to sell nuclear reactors and fuel to Egypt. As a surprise token of his friendship, Nixon gave Sadat the $2 million helicopter in which they had flown. Members of the presidential party joked to the pilot that he would be the president's next state gift. On the motorcade to the airport, the president emerged from his Lincoln convertible, waded into the masses, and was mobbed. Secret Service agents, incredulous at his recklessness, flailed at the faceless bodies until they could establish a cordon around him. Then, as gently as possible, they pushed him back into the car and whisked him away. Relieved at the close call, the security men asked each other why Haig didn't intervene. It was the chief of staff's job. Haldeman had sometimes let the president take small risks in motorcades and crowds, but never anything like this. What was wrong? Couldn't Haig talk sense to the president? But Nixon continued to chart his own course, ordering that whatever free time his schedule called for be devoted to more public appearances, particularly if they might involve large crowds. That afternoon, after crossing the Red Sea by plane to Saudi Arabia, he rode from the airport to Jeddah in King Faisal's Rolls-Royce. The Secret Service, which always prefers that a president use his own limousine with an agent at the wheel, was horrified. The president seemed to be doing everything he could to make his protection more difficult. The following morning, the president refused to be driven in anybody's car. In spite of the pain in his leg, he insisted on making the 5-minute walk across the Alhambra Palace grounds to his meeting with the king. At the departure ceremony that afternoon, Faisal's farewell message went beyond pro forma tribute paying. "What is very important is that our friends in the United States of America be themselves wise enough to stand behind you, to rally around you, Mr. President, in your noble efforts, almost unprecedented in the history of mankind, the efforts aimed at securing peace and justice in the world. And anybody who stands against you, Mr. President, in the United States of America or outside the United States of America, or stands against us, your friends in this part of the world, obviously has one aim in mind, namely that of splintering the world, the bringing on of mischief." The president flew east once more to Damascus, Syria. Again, he was ignoring the advice of those responsible for his safety. They had been insistent that this part of the trip be canceled. Syria had broken off relations with the United States in 1967. The absence of diplomatic facilities made it impossible to secure adequate intelligence about terrorist activities. The extraordinary number of Palestinian refugees was gravely worrisome to the Secret Service. Worse, the limited American intelligence available was skeptical of President Assad's ability to control either the government or the population of revolutionary Syria. 30 minutes out of Damascus, the president's plane was cruising at 15,000 feet. George Julwan, Haig's assistant, noticed 2 Russian-built MiG jets approaching on the left. "Look," he shouted, "we've got fighter escorts." Somebody else pointed out 2 more jets closing from the right. Brent Scowcroft knew that the advance team always prohibited any such escort. "Wouldn't this be a hell of an ending?" he said. Hinkle got up to investigate. As he turned, the plane suddenly began a nosedive and went into a series of rolls. Hinkle was thrown across the aisle into the seat next to Scowcroft. He looked up at Scowcroft's soft gray eyes. They were bulging like 2 silver dollars. Colonel Ralph Abertazzi, the president's pilot, took the giant jet through a series of evasive turns and steep banks for 7 minutes, while he sought assurance that the 4 Syrian aircraft were friendly. Finally convinced, Abertazzi resumed his approach pattern and landed. As the plane taxied to a halt, Syrian security men were still confiscating handsomely printed leaflets distributed that morning throughout the low-income districts of Damascus. Quote, "Was all the war, all the blood that was shed under American bombs, all the dead we suffered so that Nixon and the prophet of imperialism, Kissinger, could visit Damascus and give us $100 million? End quote. The 28-mile route to the city was lined with soldiers armed with Russian-made AK-47 automatic rifles. As the crowds grew thicker, the president insisted that the roof of the limousine be opened. He stood smiling and waving. The spectators were subdued for the most part, more curious than enthusiastic. Revolutionary Damascus welcomes President Nixon, the sign said. His meeting with Assad was instructive. As they talked, Assad's young son turned to his father and said, "Isn't Nixon the one you said on TV is a foreign devil and the friend of the Jews? Now you are having him here? Why?" Assad said to Nixon, "That's my son. That's also my people. So you see my problems." On the afternoon of Sunday, June 16th, the two leaders announced the resumption of diplomatic relations between their countries. Then the president jetted off to Israel to promise the Israelis the same nuclear power capability he had offered Egypt. 19,000 armed troops and security agents provided the toughest security ever afforded a foreign visitor. The road to Jerusalem was lined with workers and children who had been given the day off. Their placards proclaimed mixed feelings. "Blessed be your welcome. Don't sell us out. You can't run from justice." And "Welcome President Ford." After a visit to Jordan on June 17th, the president headed for home. Aboard Air Force One, he emerged from his cabin in a red plaid sports coat and strolled back to the staff section, stopping to talk with everyone except the members of the press pool. He was tanned, but he looked tired. In 9 days, he had traveled 14,775 miles and had met with 7 heads of state. Reaching speechwriter Dave Gergen, he lingered. "I used a lot of your stuff," he said. "Not all of it, of course, you understand." Gergen nodded. "Now that you've had this experience, would you like to be an ambassador?" Nixon asked. Gergen, 33 years old, didn't know what to say. The idea was preposterous. The president asked him if he spoke French. "Not very well." "Then I'll have to send you to Iraq," Nixon said. The president's helicopter landed on the South Lawn at 4:29 p.m. Wednesday, June 19th. Vice President Ford, members of the cabinet, 200 teenage Republicans, and most of the White House staff were waiting. They waved small American flags and chanted, "2 more years, 2 more years." Welcoming the president home, Ford quoted an Arabic saying, May Allah make the end better than the beginning." And we come to the end of chapter 16 and move right on into chapter 17. June 21st was the Nixons' 34th wedding anniversary. That day, the president's former special counsel, Charles W. Colson, was sentenced to a 1 to 3 year term in the federal penitentiary. Reading from a prepared statement, Colson implicated the president in his crime. Nixon had, quote, "on numerous occasions urged me to disseminate damaging information about Daniel Ellsberg," end quote, the same act for which Colson was going to jail. He was convinced that the president, quote, "believed he was acting in the national interest," Colson added. Nixon was at Camp David for 3 days' rest and to prepare for his trip to Russia. Though the swelling in his leg had eased somewhat, his doctors pleaded with him to postpone the trip. He refused. The press, which had finally learned of his illness, was told that he had suffered, quote, "a mild case of phlebitis" on the last journey, but that it had abated. The crew of Air Force One had barely time to apply a coat of turtle wax to the fuselage before the president flew away from Watergate again, bound for Brussels and then the Soviet Union. He crossed the Atlantic with his left leg elevated to reduce the pain. He was looking forward to his meeting with Brezhnev. The Secretary General of the Communist Party was his friend. The 36 hours in Belgium were given over largely to ceremonial meetings, called to assure America's NATO allies that the president would make no agreements with the Soviet Union until they had been consulted. At Vnukovo Airport, Secretary Brezhnev bounded across the tarmac to greet Nixon, leaving his translator behind for the moment. As they drove to the Kremlin in Brezhnev's black ZIL limousine, they talked animatedly, pausing to wave to respectful Muscovites gathered at prearranged points along the route. Many of the spectators held small Soviet and American flags. The president was genuinely fond of his Soviet colleague. Brutal politician though he might be, Brezhnev could also be jovial, sentimental, gregarious, and a marvelous raconteur. He had the elemental qualities of the crude, rough-talking, heavy-drinking comrade, Kissinger observed in a private moment, qualities that Nixon himself lacked but was drawn to. Regardless of the warm greeting, the president knew he could expect only so much from Brezhnev. The Soviet press had largely ignored Watergate. When the matter was referred to, it was portrayed as a plot to destroy détente. But the Kremlin understood the precarious nature of Nixon's position. KGB agents stationed in Washington under journalistic cover had been canvassing American politicians and reporters about the likelihood of the president's finishing his term. Pointedly, Soviet officials told Western journalists that they expected no dramatic results from the Moscow Summit Conference. Rather, they hoped to, quote, traditionalize the principle of top-level meetings, no matter who was president. The president had his usual present for Brezhnev, an American automobile for the secretary's extensive collection. Their first two summits in 1972 and 1973 had yielded two $10,000 models, a Cadillac Limousine and a Lincoln Continental. This time it was a $5,578 Chevrolet Monte Carlo, not very impressive in a garage that already housed a Citroen Maserati Speedster, Rolls-Royce, and Mercedes sedans, and Brezhnev's favorite, a new Mercedes 300 SL Roadster. But Brezhnev had learned that the Monte Carlo was named Car of the Year by Motor Trend magazine, and he had let it be known that he would like one. The Nixon-Brezhnev Summit of 1972 had resulted in a treaty limiting each country's defensive and offensive nuclear missile systems, the top jewel in the crown of the administration's foreign policy agreements. Their summit in 1973 had kept John Dean on ice for a week, as the Senate Watergate Committee suspended its hearings in deference to Brezhnev's visit to the United States. Now the 1974 summit was suspect in Congress, where fears were widespread that the president might somehow sell out in desperation to get an arms limitation agreement which would improve his public standing. Nixon and Kissinger were of one mind in believing that limiting the expansion of nuclear weapon systems and maintaining parity in the balance of nuclear terror were the key to a successful détente with the Soviet Union. And in their grand strategy, the American-Soviet relationship was the key to world peace. The United States' influence in every area of the world was predicated on a delicate, cooperative relationship with the Russians. Every major diplomatic move was viewed in relation to this prospective Soviet reaction. The ability of the United States to promote peace in the Middle East or to fight in Vietnam hinged on an at least tacit acceptance by the Russians. Because so much was premised on the balance of nuclear force, no treaty was regarded as more important by Nixon or Kissinger than a permanent strategic arms limitation, SALT, agreement. The president had often confided to Kissinger his most telling reason for slowing down the nuclear arms race. He feared that the United States would lose it. Continued military competition was too expensive. The country might not be able to sustain the costs of a prolonged Cold War. America, the president felt, was too likely to buckle under the pressure. Besides the economic weakness of the country, Nixon perceived a weakness of will. Too many of the same political critics who were pushing him to the wall on Watergate would not support a tough posture toward the Russians, he said. The president and Kissinger regarded the stakes in the 1974 summit as especially high. If they offered the kind of tough proposal they preferred, its rejection would almost inevitably escalate the arms race. If they offered a less ambitious proposal, which the Soviets were more likely to accept, Nixon would be accused by critics of selling out for a cheap, Watergate-motivated deal. Both Kissinger and the president had decided to lean in the direction of making the Soviets a more palatable offer and taking a chance with the critics at home. They were in agreement that their proposal served American interests well, but Kissinger calculated that the prospects of any satisfactory agreement were substantially reduced by Watergate. The Soviets were likely to test how far the president would bend. Kissinger was less than absolute in his confidence that Nixon could withstand the pressure. His concern went beyond the question of Nixon's will, however. The president had not done his homework, and he seemed distracted. Unless he mastered his briefing book in a matter of hours, Kissinger feared, Nixon would never be able to grasp the essential details of the complex negotiations. Normally, Kissinger would have taken his concern to Hague, but there was little time left, and besides, Kissinger was loath to talk with the general. During the planning for the trip, Haig had been assigned quarters adjacent to the president's suite in the Kremlin Palace. Kissinger, who had wanted them, had registered a bitter protest through Scowcroft. Haig had responded that the White House Chief of Staff needed to be at the president's side. The battle over the suite lasted several days, and conflicting instructions had gone to the advance team. White House communication agents installed, removed, replaced, removed again, and reinstalled special communications equipment as the prospective occupant changed again and again. Scowcroft could see how short Kissinger's fuse had become. He was drawn and tense, even more snappish than usual. Haig finally won the contest for the room. Technically, the advanced staff worked for him. Kissinger, unwilling to expose his interest any further, did not appeal the decision to the president. But his attack on Haig continued. The summit was a diplomatic trip, he told his aides. Why in the hell did the chief of staff, nothing but a bureaucrat in essence, have to be close to the president? It was he, not Haig, who was to mastermind the summit strategy. It was he, not Haig, who would keep the president from making a serious error. It was he, not Haig, who would actually conduct the business when the president finished with his ritual toasts and posing for pictures. Haig knew nothing about the summit. General Haig is out for himself, and when it comes to the crunch, he puts himself first, Kissinger said. At that night's dinner in the Granovit Hall of the Kremlin, the president used the first exchange of toasts to attribute existing arms agreements to the relationship between Brezhnev and himself. He raised his glass. The agreements, he said, quote, were possible because of a personal relationship that was established between the General Secretary and the President of the United States. And that personal relationship extends to the top officials in both of our governments. It has been said that any agreement is only as good as the will of the parties to keep it. Because of our personal relationship, there is no question about our will to keep these agreements and to make more when they are in our mutual interests. The following morning, TASS, the Soviet news agency, translated the president's toast differently. Quote, personal relationship became, quote, the relations that have grown up between us, implying that détente was premised on the mutual interests of two nations, not of individuals. Reading the account at breakfast, Robert Kaiser, Moscow correspondent of the Washington Post, noted the distinction. He asked Jerry Warren about it. Warren's jaw seemed to drop, and he hurried to tell Ziegler. That afternoon, Ziegler told reporters that there had simply been a mistake made in translation and that it would be corrected in the evening editions of Izvestia. He introduced Leonid Zamyatin, director of TASS, who said carefully, General Secretary Brezhnev and President Nixon have repeatedly emphasized the importance of their personal relationship. Ziegler beamed, but the evening's edition repeated the mistranslation, and Soviet sources told selected Moscow correspondents of American newspapers that the distinction was scarcely accidental. As the formal talks went on through the day, the Soviets carried on a game of keeping the president and his staff in the dark about the schedule. Meetings were postponed while Brezhnev napped. Then suddenly a protocol deputy would appear at the entrance to the president's quarters and announce that a meeting was imminent. The pattern continued through the first few sessions. Nixon and his staff were irritated, but they accepted the tactic. The Soviet strategy was to weaken their resolve. The psychological battering continued on Saturday, June 29th. Brezhnev insisted that the president fly with him to his retreat on the Black Sea. Then the trip was delayed, ostensibly because of the weather, then was rescheduled for a later hour. Next, it was moved back to take advantage of a break in the weather, the Russians said. Then it was postponed once more, and minutes later the Americans were informed that departure would be in half an hour. Brezhnev and Nixon snacked on caviar aboard the Secretary General's Ilyushin 62 airplane. After a 94-minute flight, they drove to Brezhnev's cliffside dacha in Orleans. And footnote adds, Orleans is a district of Yalta, only 3 miles from the center of the larger city. When the Russians had initially suggested Yalta as one of the negotiation sites, the American advance team had objected. They were concerned that Yalta, scene of the historic 1945 meeting of Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, remained a symbol of an American sellout to the Russians. The advance men referred the question back to Washington, and the president responded that if Brezhnev wanted it, so be it. The Soviets in turn agreed to refer to the meeting site as Orleans. Brezhnev escorted the president to the edge of the cliff and then into a plexiglass elevator in which they descended to the beach below. As the two leaders gazed at the sunset, Ziegler remarked how similar the Russian leader's plush vacation spa was to Nixon's San Clemente estate. Next morning, the two men walked down to the beach and its seaside swimming pool. They climbed to the top of the cliff on which the dacha perched, walked through the lush gardens, and admired the lily ponds. Haig, Kissinger, and a retinue of Brezhnev's deputies tagged along. Then, unexpectedly, the president insisted on meeting with Brezhnev alone. The two leaders headed for a meeting room between the main and guest dachas, while the others waited at the swimming pool. Kissinger had been scheduled to be with the president through all his meetings that day. The negotiations were entering their most crucial phase. He was furious at being excluded. Usually the president acquitted himself well with Brezhnev, but Nixon still hadn't mastered the briefing book, and Kissinger thought he was no match for Brezhnev, who was always extraordinarily well briefed. Brezhnev routinely mastered details that the president was accustomed to leaving to his aides. Kissinger worried that the president might make a major slip, get into unfamiliar areas, give something away accidentally. Kissinger was sweating. An hour passed. He paced up and down the length of the swimming pool. An hour and a half. He voiced his concern to his aides. Nixon and Brezhnev had never been alone together for so long. 2 hours. 2 hours. Kissinger could see the two sitting at the pale wood conference table, an assortment of beverages spread on trays next to them. Finally, the others were summoned to the meeting. As the formal talks resumed, it seemed as if the two leaders had not discussed the substance of the negotiations at all. The agenda picked up exactly where it had been, as if nothing had happened. Kissinger and Haig were profoundly troubled. So was everybody else in the presidential party. They had no idea of what the two had discussed, but whatever it was, it became apparent that the president had made no commitments which would compromise the American bargaining strategy. As the talks got more technical, Nixon deferred to Kissinger. Brezhnev continued to conduct the Soviet side of the negotiations, using two Soviet generals as messengers to shuttle in and out with charts of missile strength levels. Then abruptly, Brezhnev announced that there could be no agreement on limiting offensive nuclear weapons. Nothing was possible without greater American concessions, he said. The Americans must allow the Russians a greater number of missiles as compensation for long-range U.S. bombers in Europe and multiple warhead missiles. The president seemed perplexed. Kissinger was stunned. They had expected resistance, but not to this degree. Brezhnev was adopting an extremely hard line. They tried again. Brezhnev could not be moved. The president sat gazing out the windows, looking toward the sea. He desperately wanted some sort of agreement to take back to Washington, but he could not make any further concessions without sacrificing U.S. strategic interests. He had no card left to play. He held firm. That evening, the presidential party had dinner aboard a 115-foot yacht of the Soviet Navy. Nixon and Brezhnev moved aft, drinking as they sailed across the Black Sea in the shadow of the sheer cliffs of the Yala Mountains. Brezhnev, wearing sunglasses, chain-smoked Russian cigarettes. The left sleeve of his blue-gray coat slipped above his tanned wrist, exposing an expensive gold watch. The president, dressed in gray slacks and a maroon sports jacket with the customary American flag pin in the lapel, stared out over the water, wistfully at times, a few strands of hair blowing forward across his face. The next day, Brezhnev and Kissinger returned to Moscow, and the president traveled to Minsk. And in footnote says the press plane flying behind the president lost a tire on takeoff and an engine during the flight. The navigator of the Soviet craft walked into the passenger section and poured himself a shot of vodka, then two more to take back to the cockpit. The president visited Katyn, K-A-T-Y-N, where 149 Russians had been forced into a barn and burned alive by Nazi troops on March 22, 1943. This is in Minsk. He walked through a huge open field, then stopped at the statue of a man carrying his dead child in his arms. He sat down alone at a small table and signed the guest book. The only sounds were the tolling of the memorial bells every 15 seconds and the clicking shutters of the photographers. The press office staff worried about the eerie, lonely image of the president. Nixon returned to Moscow Monday evening and conferred with Kissinger. The Secretary of State had spoken with Brezhnev and had then spent 5 hours bargaining with Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. They had finally worked out an alternative to the seeming impasse on an agreement to limit offensive nuclear weapons. Both sides would sign a protocol committing themselves to eventual negotiation of an agreement that would extend to 1985. It was nothing more than an agreement to agree at some future time. Kissinger usually detested such arrangements. They limited future bargaining options, he felt. But the two sides agreed it was preferable to acknowledging that the momentum of détente had been broken. So they would have this appearance of an agreement, as well as a settlement of two much less important issues. limitations on underground testing, and installation of defensive missile systems. The president's disappointment was obvious. He had hoped for far more. He joined Brezhnev later that evening for a final exchange of toasts. Brezhnev remarked that the agreements, quote, could probably have been wider. The president reemphasized the great importance of variously his personal relations, his personal friendship, and his personal relationship with Brezhnev. The Soviet leader was unresponsive to the overture. He spoke of the, quote, feelings of respect and friendship between the American and Russian peoples. The signing ceremonies took place the next morning. Ziegler struggled to give the summit a public relations coloring beyond its substantive progress, praising the agreements in the hyperbole of history. Throughout the trip, he had been insistent that Kissinger be excluded from the ritual picture-taking sessions. The pictures were to be of the president and Brezhnev. In all but one instance, the photos of the major ceremonies showed the two leaders alone. During the 9.5-hour flight back to the United States, the president worked on a speech. Quote, the progress of peace is going steadily forward, to be delivered on live television when he stopped in Maine. From there, he would fly directly to Key Biscayne. He didn't want even to visit Washington. Vice President Ford presided over the televised welcoming in Maine. I cannot escape the conclusion, he said, that the biblical injunction, blessed are the peacemakers, has again been confirmed. And thus ends chapter 17. I've taken way extra long this time in this session, but I wanted to finish this chapter. And in the next session, we'll move on to chapter 18. Thank you for watching.